Hey guys, Eternal Phoenix here with Vinland Saga Chapter 3. So like I said at the end of the last chapter, Leif Erikson discovered America well before Christopher Columbus, and funny enough, the chapter picks back up where it left off with the story of Vinland told by none other than Leif Erikson, with this whole chapter taking place in the past compared to Chapter 2. It is here that he explains to the children that the land was massive with forests and meadows everywhere, and how they encountered the Skraelings, aka Native Americans, and that his headdress and pipe were gifts from the natives in proof of his travels, and that only warriors wear the headdress, only to be shortly after discredited by the children who say that Jormungand, or Jormungandr, the world serpent, eats all ships that travel too far west, and that even beyond that, any ship that travels too far west would just fall off the earth, which was a common belief at that time. However, I think Jormungand or Jormungandr is specific to Norse mythology. Again, just being like a giant serpent that encases the entire planet to the point where it can reach its own tail. Over the next few panels, Leif struggles to get the children to believe his story, with all of them mocking him and basically calling him a liar and comparing him to a child, to the point that even Thorfinn begins to turn his back on him. But he takes his father Thor's word above all else, and he basically says, well, you may be an adventurer and you may be like a warrior, or you may not be a warrior to the kids, but if my father says you're a warrior, then you're a warrior. It's actually funny to see how Thorfinn went from being, well, a kid to the murder machine that we saw in the past two chapters. And just in the few short years too. Meanwhile, Thors comes in from the cold and into the middle of all this, and Leif essentially begs him to get the kids to believe him because they trust his word above all else. And we also cut over from this panel to see a slave walking through a blizzard. There's not really much context here, but we will get more to that later. Back at the house, Thors is discussing with Leif, and they're basically talking about how the state of Greenland is and how they're going through a harsh winter, which based off that alone tells me that they're currently in Iceland. Which, funny enough, for those of you who don't know, Iceland is not covered in ice, but Greenland is. It was actually named by a guy, and I'm probably going to butcher the name, Hrafna Floki, who essentially went to Iceland. He had a horrible time and he went through a few personal losses, and one day while he was depressed, he apparently climbed a hill and saw a river, or like a ford, covered in ice, and he named it Iceland. And then later, Eric the Red discovered what is now known as Greenland, but it was covered in ice, and so he figured naming it Greenland would get more people to settle there. And now you know, well, now you know why Greenland is icy and Iceland is green. But moving on, Leif tells Thors that with the way the weather has been, it will cost them their livestock, and he doesn't see things returning to normal. We also get introduced to Thor's daughter, Ylva, and the older sister, and I assume the only sister, of Thorfinn, who have been bringing in some sheep due to the cold. And we actually get a confirmation from Leif at this point also that they are in fact in Iceland. And side note, because I actually had to look this up, but it has in the panel sheep with horns. I did not know that sheep had horns. Every depiction of them that I've ever seen has not had horns, but apparently there are some wild breeds of sheep, or just different breeds of sheep in general, that have horns. But moving on, Leif continues saying that he fears Greenland will be smothered by a winter that the people won't be able to survive, which, spoiler alert, is exactly what happened in real life. And he says that his brother already plans to move from Greenland to Iceland. In the next few panels, we see Thorfinn dreaming of setting sail to only be captured by Jormungand, and the following morning, Ylva and Thors are cleaning off the snow from their roof, with Thorfinn being really too young to take part in the chores, and we actually find out here that Thorfinn's mother, Thors' wife, is sickly, and so she cannot help as well. But because it's just Thors and Ylva doing the cleaning, she complains to him that they should buy a slave to do the work for them because their neighbors do. And it's here that we learn that Thors isn't really all about that. He doesn't really believe in humans owning another human. He says that, their neighbors have their way and that we have our way. And apologies for those of you watching. Slavery seems to be a common topic so far, and if that makes anyone uncomfortable, I didn't write it. This is the series everyone voted for, so just keep that in mind. But moving on, Ylva loses her footing and falls off the roof and lands into a pile of snow, only to find the runaway slave from earlier. But we don't really stay on that for too long, because we pan back over to Thorfinn and Leif, who are prepping a boat, and to the dismay of Leif, Thorfinn still doesn't believe his story and says that if he can set sail with Leif, then he'll believe him and believe that Vinland is real. But Leif tells him he'd have a better chance sailing on his father's ship, but Thors won't let that happen because Thorfinn just isn't ready. And essentially Leif is telling him the same thing, and Thorfinn Thorfinn basically just thinks that everyone treats him like a child, and he is a child, and he says that basically, you and my father are no fun. And it's at this point that it starts to remind me of the Disney movie Moana, because Leif goes on to say that he once took a voyage when he was younger and became shipwrecked on ice for a month, and he lost all his men in the process, barely escaping with his life, which prompts Thorfinn to ask why their people would move to such a harsh place. Meanwhile, Thors has brought a slave inside he brought the slave inside to warm him up, but he's already frostbitten from being in the snow all night and apparently isn't breathing. And unlike Thors and his wife, who by the way hasn't yet been named, so I don't really know what her name is yet, I'll try to get that information to you in the next chapter if they drop it, or I'll just look it up in the meantime. But they're helping this man, and Ylva is on the sidelines basically saying that they shouldn't help him because he's a runaway slave. And as the chapter comes to a close, we pan back over to Leif, who explains that they came over to Iceland and Greenland because their old home of Norway was being taken over by a man named Harald, later known as the first king of Norway, and that in Greenland and Iceland there are no kings, only village representatives. But not wanting to believe that their people would ever run away from something they didn't like, Thorfinn, ironically, runs away from something he didn't like, calling Leif a liar and running to ask his father for his advice, saying that his father would never lie to him, at least he would tell him the truth. And in all honesty, for the son of a Viking, Thorfinn goes running to his father a lot, just in general. You would think he'd be a little tougher for that, even though he's still fairly young. Like, I get that he's a kid, but he's a daddy's boy. So he runs back to his home to see his father Thors revive the slave through what I can only assume is their version of CPR, which in no way should really work after being stuck outside overnight and not breathing. I assume for some time, but I'll let that slide. We then learn that the man is a slave to Lord Halfdan, and due to the terrible abuse he suffered, he did not want to go back, literally crying, begging not to be sent back, but proclaiming he has nowhere else to go. And the chapter finally closes with Halfdan's arrival, looking for the runaway slave with a group of warriors. Honestly, for so little to have really happened in this chapter, we got a lot of information. I'm not sure how long we will be staying in the flashbacks, but it's honestly pretty interesting. So, with that said, thank you to everyone who stuck it out for this review. I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. Eternal Phoenix, signing out.